a marked path that what mysteries lie behind the rise and fall of a tribe destined for greatness? Was it a chain of human decisions or an inescapable destiny decreed from the heavens that sealed the course of the tribe of Dan? In this narrative, bravery, betrayal, faith, and apostasy are interwoven. It is the story of a lineage that began with a brilliant promise and ended wrapped in the mist of oblivion. The tribe of Dan was a key piece in the puzzle of Israel, but their acts, choices, and silences gradually led them to the margins of the sacred narrative. This is the chronicle of a people who, despite having the potential to mark generations, ended up becoming an example of warning, a legend that fades with time, and whose memory serves as a mirror for our own decisions. From the birth of their patriarch to their disappearance from the lists of the redeemed tribes, Dan reminds us that even those who have been called to great things can be lost if they abandon the voice of the Most High. It is also a story of lost opportunities, of power without obedience, and of what happens when a tribe decides to carve its own path apart from the divine will. Their history, like the serpent that slithers unseen, is full of subtle warnings, silent decisions, and irreversible outcomes. Born to judge in the dry and ancient landscape of Padan-aram, under a sky that seemed to burn with judgment and revelation, Dan came into the world. He was the son of Jacob, patriarch of Israel, and of Bilhah, Rachel's handmaid. His birth was not coincidence nor accident. It was interpreted as divine justice. Rachel, barren for a long time, proclaimed with joy, "God has vindicated me," and she gave him the name Dan, the one who judges. From his first breath, Dan represented vindication and hope. Throughout his life, Dan stood out among his brothers not by brute force, but by his natural cunning and his sharp sense of opportunity. He was a born strategist. This peculiarity would be reflected in Jacob's prophecy, who described him as a serpent by the roadside, ready to unbalance the rider at the precise moment. Those words were not a simple praise. They were a veiled warning about the double edge of Dan's character. The complex dynamic among Jacob's sons profoundly affected Dan. As the son of a handmaid, but also supported by Rachel's love, Dan had one foot in power and another in marginalization. This constant tension forced him to develop an innate ability to navigate uncertain waters. His life unfolded in a tense family environment, marked by rivalries, favoritism, and latent betrayals. It was precisely in this context that one of the most tragic stories in Israel began to take shape, the betrayal of Joseph. Although Dan was not the mastermind of the plan, his silence and his role in the shadows indicate an ambiguous participation. That moral ambiguity would be a constant in the history of his tribe. While his brothers devised the plan to sell Joseph as a slave, Dan observed, calculated, and kept silent. In his heart, he perhaps struggled between family loyalty and resentment for his position as the son of a handmaid. This mix of strategic silences and contained ambitions shaped the character of the tribe of Dan. From the beginning, they knew how to move with cunning, but they also learned to survive without drawing attention, acting from the shadows when the moment demanded it. Just like the serpent that waits patiently before striking, the Danites were forged as a lineage of calculators, capable of changing the course of events without directly dirtying their hands, a trait that would be both their strength and their downfall. Chapter 2. Promise in a Foreign Land. Egypt, land of pyramids, of pharaohs, of mystery and power. For Jacob's family, this place initially represented a lifeline against the famine that was devouring Canaan. It was Joseph, the dreamer sold, the outcast redeemed, who there became the providential instrument to preserve his family. And it was under his protection that the children of Israel, including the descendants of Dan, found shelter in a foreign land. But what began as refuge quickly transformed into a testing ground. In Egypt, the tribe of Dan began to manifest their identity as a group more clearly. Their intellectual sharpness and their inclination toward strategy distinguished them even within the Israelite collective. They adapted quickly to new conditions, learned the language, understood the Egyptian production systems, and became key pieces within the structure of the Hebrew people. But that same adaptability carries a risk, that of diluting one's own identity in the midst of a dominant culture. Jacob, before dying, gathered his sons to transmit his last words. Jacob's blessings were not simple farewells. They were prophetic declarations, spiritual designs that would trace the destiny of each tribe. Speaking of Dan, the patriarch said, "Dan will judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. He will be a serpent by the roadside, a viper along the path, that bites the horse's heels so that its rider falls backward." It was not a common blessing. It was a warning wrapped in praise. Jacob recognized Dan's singular role, an executor of justice, but with unexpected methods, not always orthodox. During the first years in Egypt, while the memory of Joseph was still fresh and the pharaohs showed them favor, the Danites prospered. They used their ingenuity to manage crops, supervise constructions, and it is even said that some came to be in contact with Egyptian scribes, learning their writing. But with the passage of time, favor turned into threat. A new pharaoh, who did not know Joseph nor respect his legacy, saw in the Hebrews a dangerous population, numerous, different. That it was then that slavery began, a progressive slavery strategically implemented that stripped the people of their dignity step by step. The Danites, like their brothers, were forced to build cities, carry stones, endure whippings. But unlike other tribes that clung to the past with stubbornness, Dan reacted with their distinctive sharpness. They adapted, yes, but they also resisted in veiled ways. They began to transmit messages in work songs, in weaving patterns, in verses that seemed innocent but contained codes. They were organized. They knew how to observe the enemy, detect patterns, find cracks in the system. But they also fell prey to their greatest weakness, the temptation to blend with the Egyptian. Some Danites, tired of suffering, began to experiment with the gods of Egypt, seeking comfort where it should not be found. Others began to adopt their customs, their way of dressing, even their religious expressions. Even so, the memory of Jacob's words remained alive. "We will judge our people," they told each other when hope faltered. They knew they were called to something more. At night, after exhausting workdays, they gathered in secret to recite ancient prayers, tell stories of the patriarchs, repeat God's promises. In the midst of darkness, they resisted with cunning. And it was in that context, when hope was beginning to die, that a rumor spread among the slaves. A Hebrew raised in Pharaoh's court had returned. Moses, a name that sparked the flame of expectation. Dan was one of the first tribes to pay attention, not because they were the most pious, but because they knew how to identify the winds of change. The serpent of prophecy was awakening. The Danites, experts at reading between the lines, understood that something great was approaching. They prepared. Some hid tools. Others began to trace escape routes. Each family shared their ancestral knowledge. The years of slavery had not erased their heritage. They had only buried it under the dust of Egypt. And now, with the roar of the plagues and Moses' firm voice, that heritage was taking shape again. The air in Egypt began to change. The plagues, one after another, challenged not only Pharaoh, but also the Egyptian gods. Each blow was a declaration that the God of Israel was more powerful than the stone idols. The Danites observed, analyzed, learned. They understood that liberation would not only be physical, but also spiritual. They had to leave behind not only the chains, but also the customs they had absorbed. It was a battle in their hearts. And when finally the gates opened and the Hebrews left en masse toward the desert, the tribe of Dan was ready. They were not the most numerous, nor the most pious, but they carried with them the determination of a people who never forgot their call to judge. The judgment would begin with themselves. It was time to redeem themselves, to once again be an active part of God's plan. The Exodus was not just an exit. It was an opportunity to be reborn. The story of Dan in Egypt is the story of all of us. The struggle between adapting or resisting, between preserving faith or embracing the comfort of the world. It teaches us that even in the deepest slavery, God's call remains intact, waiting for us to respond. The tribe of Dan did so. Will we? Chapter 3, Sand, Fire, and Redemption. The desert sun shows no mercy. Relentless and scorching, it stretches over the dunes like a silent judgment. After the glorious departure from Egypt, with the roar of the Red Sea closed over Pharaoh's armies, the children of Israel found themselves face to face with a new kind of trial, the solitude, scarcity, and uncertainty of the desert. The tribe of Dan, as part of the liberated people, ventured into that vast immensity with feet full of dust and hearts beating between fear and hope. The Exodus was not a simple migration. It was a purification. Each step took the Hebrews away from the palaces of Egypt, but also from their customs, from their gods, from their mental chains. For Dan, the desert was a field of spiritual training and a school of transformation. At first, they walked with enthusiasm, excited about freedom, singing songs of victory alongside Miriam. But soon, the heat, hunger, the monotony of manna, and the lack of water began to corrode their enthusiasm. "You have brought us to the desert to die," some murmured, and among them, many Danites. Freedom without security was more terrifying to them than familiar slavery. But not everyone thought the same. There were among them voices that remembered Jacob's prophecy, the call to judge, to protect, to act with cunning. It was those men who began to look at the desert with different eyes. While others only saw sand, they studied routes, wind patterns, natural hiding places. They were preparing for a role that God himself had predicted. But it was in the midst of this stage that God called Oholiab, son of Ahisamach of the tribe of Dan. The Lord filled him with wisdom, understanding, and skill to work with gold, silver, bronze, stone, wood, and fabrics. He was chosen alongside Bezalel to build the tabernacle. This appointment was not coincidental. It showed that Dan would not only be known for their cunning, but also for their art, for their ability to shape the sacred. Oholiab became a symbol of hope for his tribe. Under his direction, the Danites contributed their ingenuity, their steady hand, their attention to detail. Every knot in the curtains, every inlay in the furniture spoke of a tribe that knew how to transform judgment into beauty. While others built complaints, Dan helped build the house of God. But the story would not be complete without mentioning the shadow, because the tribe of Dan, like the rest of Israel, also participated in the sin of the golden calf. It was in Moses' absence, when he went up to Mount Sinai, that impatience took hold of the people. The Danites, so accustomed to acting quickly, were easy prey to anxiety. They saw in the absence a sign of abandonment, and in the idol, a tangible solution. Some among them applauded the creation of the calf, others kept silent. Few opposed it. That participation deeply marked their history, not only because of the divine punishment, but because of the internal wound it left. They realized, too late, that cunning without faith is just rebellion in disguise. God, however, did not abandon his people. The tabernacle was built, and the divine presence filled it. Oholiab continued to be a key figure, and the tribe of Dan began to redefine their identity. They would no longer be just cunning, but also consecrated. In the years that followed, they distinguished themselves as explorers, guides, guardians of the camp. They learned to interpret the signs of the desert, to protect the flanks, to warn of dangers before they became evident. In the first census, Dan counted more than 62,000 men of military age. It was a considerable force, and they were assigned a position in the camp to the north of the tabernacle. It was no coincidence. To the north were the winds, the external threats. Dan would be the shield. Despite their growth, a restlessness began to arise in the hearts of the Danites. The desert, although formative, was not the final destination. They longed for the promised land, the sworn inheritance. And even more, they desired a place where their ingenuity could flourish, where their value would be recognized, where they could prove that they were more than a cunning tribe. They were heirs of an eternal promise. The desert was for Dan a burning forge. It took away their Egyptian comfort, but gave them something more precious, spiritual direction. They learned that surviving is not enough, that God cannot be replaced with molten gold, and that true judgment begins with oneself. They became artisans, warriors, watchmen. They were ready. The dust of the desert was no longer a nuisance. It was part of their armor. When the cloud rose and the camp moved, the Danites advanced with determination. They knew that each step brought them closer to the fulfillment of an ancient promise. And in their hearts, a truth began to beat with renewed strength. There was no future without faithfulness, no conquest without consecration. There was much to traverse, but Dan was no longer just the serpent on the path. They were also the silent guardian of hope. Chapter 4. Conquest and Decision. The Jordan River stretched before them like a living frontier, a barrier that not only divided territories, but also histories. Crossing it meant leaving behind the desert and entering the fulfillment of promises. But it also meant facing real enemies, fortified peoples, cities that would not be willing to yield without a fight. The tribe of Dan, hardened by waiting and molded by the dust of Sinai, was preparing to take the most important step of their existence. The crossing of the Jordan was miraculous. The waters stopped as they had at the Red Sea, giving dry passage for the people to cross. The Danites crossed with their eyes fixed on the horizon, their banners waving in the wind, their hearts divided between emotion and memory. Each footstep was an echo of entire generations who had dreamed of that moment. But not everything was joy. They knew that the land promised to them was not a gift wrapped in gold. It was a conquest. Joshua, Moses' successor, guided the people with firmness. His leadership transmitted confidence, and his words resonated with the authority of heaven. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead this people to inherit the land I swore to give their ancestors. The tribe of Dan took those words as a personal declaration. They knew that, because of their size, their intelligence, and their history, they had a role to play. They would not be spectators. However, the territory assigned to Dan soon proved problematic. Located on the coastal plain, it bordered the Philistines, a strong, belligerent people with superior military technology and a consolidated warrior culture. The Danites tried to establish themselves, but were rejected time and again. Their villages were attacked, their lands plundered, their leaders put to the test. The dream of the promised land was turning into a nightmare. But it was then that voices rose within the tribe questioning Joshua's assignment. Why have we been given only this portion? They complained. We are numerous. The Lord has blessed us. We deserve more. But the problem was not only of quantity, but of strategy. The location of their territory left them exposed, and the enemy they faced required more than bravery. It required wisdom. With their characteristic sharpness, the Danites sent spies to the north in search of a new home. They crossed the hills of Ephraim, advanced in silence, until they reached a city called Laish. What they found there seemed too good to be true, a peaceful, prosperous city, without alliances with neighboring nations, without an apparent army. It was easy prey. The spies returned euphoric. The land is good. The people live peacefully. Do not hesitate to go and take it. The decision was made quickly. 600 armed Danite warriors set out on the march toward Laish. They did not go alone. They were accompanied by their families, their livestock, their belongings. They were not fleeing. They were rewriting their destiny. On the way, however, they committed an act that would mark their history. They stopped at the house of Micah, a man who had built a personal sanctuary with carved idols and a hired Levite priest. The Danites, seeing the opportunity, stole the idol, the ephod, and persuaded the priest to join them. Isn't it better to be a priest of an entire tribe than of a single household? They said to him. The priest agreed. The theft was not only material, it was spiritual. They carried with them not only weapons and provisions, but a deviation from the right path. The taking of Laish was brutal. They attacked by surprise, put the city to the sword, burned the houses, and upon the ruins, they founded a new city, Dan. They named it in honor of their patriarch. Finally, they had a land. A good land, defensible, far from the conflict with the Philistines. But the conquest left a stain. It was not directed by God, nor approved by the prophets. It was a pragmatic decision, cunning, but not necessarily pious. There, at the extreme north of Israel, Dan flourished. Its geographical position made it a vital strategic point. From Dan to Beersheba became a common expression to speak of all Israelite territory. The tribe gained relevance, prosperity, power, but they also moved away from the spiritual center of the people, Shiloh, and later, Jerusalem. The sanctuary they built in their new city became an alternative center of worship. Over time, the idol stolen from Micah was replaced by others. The Levite priest became the patriarch of a Danite priestly dynasty. What started as a logistical necessity transformed into a religious schism. The story of Dan's conquest is a mirror of our human nature. A story of talent, bravery, vision, but also of impatience, shortcuts, dangerous independence. They chose cunning over obedience, result over process, success over submission. And although they prospered, they left an open crack in their relationship with God that would grow over time until it fractured them completely. Mark, chapter 5, the judge Samson. But in an era of repetitive cycles of redemption and downfall, where the people of Israel time and again turned away from God only to then cry out for his help, the judges arose. They were not kings nor prophets, but charismatic leaders raised by the Lord to deliver and restore his people. Among all of them, one stood out for his superhuman strength and his tragic story: Samson, son of the tribe of Dan. Samson's story began even before his birth. His mother, a barren woman, received the visit of an angel of the Lord who announced that she would give birth to a son consecrated from the womb. He shall drink no wine, nor strong drink, nor shall a razor touch his head. The heavenly messenger warned her, for the child shall be a Nazarite, consecrated to God, and he will begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines. From the beginning, Samson's life was marked by the extraordinary. His strength was a divine gift, a visible reflection of God's presence upon him. But he also carried within him an internal fragility, an Achilles heel that manifested not in his muscles, but in his heart. He had an appetite for the forbidden, a constant impulse toward what would take him away from the holy calling he had received. His first great slip was his desire to marry a Philistine woman from Timnah. Despite his parents' opposition, who begged him to choose a wife from among his own people, Samson insisted, "She pleases me." This seemingly innocent phrase would be the seed of many of his conflicts. During his wedding celebration, he proposed a riddle to the Philistine guests based on a previous experience. He had killed a lion with his bare hands and later found a swarm of bees and honey in its carcass. Out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet, he told them. When the Philistines could not solve the riddle, they pressured Samson's wife to extract the answer from him. She yielded, and by revealing it, she triggered a chain of events that ended in violence. Samson, enraged, killed 30 men to pay the riddle's debt and withdrew from the wedding, only to later discover that his wife had been given to another man. The revenge was brutal. He set fire to the Philistines' fields by tying torches to foxes' tails. The escalation of conflict had begun. Throughout the years, Samson became a scourge for the Philistines. With the jawbone of a donkey, he killed 1,000 men. He tore off the gates of a city and carried them on his shoulders to a hill. His strength made him a legend, but his wandering heart made him vulnerable. His relationship with Delilah, another Philistine woman, would seal his fate. Delilah, bribed by the Philistine leaders, tried again and again to discover the secret of his strength. Samson toyed with her, giving her false answers. But her insistence was such that he finally yielded. "My strength is in my hair. If it is cut, I will become weak like any other man." When Samson fell asleep, Delilah called the Philistines. They cut his hair, and the man who had brought down armies was subdued without resistance. Blinded, chained, humiliated, he was taken to Gaza to entertain his enemies. But in the darkness of his blindness, something changed in him. Samson began to pray. His hair began to grow, yes, but more importantly, his heart began to change. In the temple of Dagon, while thousands of Philistines celebrated his capture, Samson cried out to heaven, "O Lord God, remember me. Let me avenge myself against the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Leaning on the pillars of the temple, he pushed with strength once more. The building collapsed upon him and his enemies. It was his last act and the most powerful, and in his death he killed more than in all his life, says the account. He was buried by his family in his father Manoah's tomb in the land of Zorah and Eshtaol. Samson's life is a painfully exact reflection of the history of the tribe of Dan. Strength, potential, divine calling, but also rebellion, distraction, and downfall. Samson's story reveals the tension between gift and character, between God's grace and our personal decisions. How can a consecrated man fall so low? How can a chosen tribe end up so far from the altar? But it is also a story of redemption, because even in his worst moment, Samson turned his heart to God, and God responded. His strength returned, and with it, his purpose. Samson died as a judge, fulfilling his mission. The tribe of Dan, in remembering their hero, should have learned the lesson. It is not just about how much you can do, but for whom you live. Samson was, is, and will always be a warning and an inspiration. His story shouts at us that God's call is irrevocable, but that its fulfillment depends on our response. Dan had their champion, but would they learn from the example or repeat his downfall? Chapter 6. The Migration to the North. Time passed. The generations of Israelites born in the desert now populated the Promised Land, distributed according to God's will revealed through Joshua. However, the tribe of Dan found no rest. Their original territorial inheritance, located on the coastal plain next to the mighty Mediterranean Sea, was a constant battlefield against the Philistines. That region, rich in resources and strategically vital, had become hostile terrain where the Danites could not prosper. Harassed, outmatched in weaponry, and pressured from all directions, the Danites began to question their situation. "Why must we fight eternally for a land we cannot keep?" they murmured among themselves. Their hearts began to lean toward an alternative. If they could not dominate the place assigned to them, they would seek another. And so, with the silent determination that had characterized their tribe since the days of Jacob, they devised a plan. 5 men were sent as scouts, warriors and wise men, but also discreet. They traversed the valleys and mountains of Ephraim until their eyes fell upon a small and peaceful settlement called Laish. The city, although prosperous, was vulnerable. Its people lived in peace, isolated, without alliances or defenses. The land is good, spacious, and without worries, the spies reported upon returning. It is far from the Sidonians and has no contact with anyone. Why do we remain doing nothing? Let us go and take it. The proposal was received with enthusiasm. 600 armed men, accompanied by their families, belongings, and livestock, set out northward. It was more than a military expedition. It was a full-scale migration. Crossing the mountains, they made a decisive stop at the house of a man named Micah in the mountainous region of Ephraim. Micah had built his own sanctuary with carved idols and a hired Levite priest. The Danites, upon discovering this place, recognized an opportunity. They entered the house, took the ephod, the idols, and persuaded the young Levite to join them. "Do you prefer to be a priest of a single family or of an entire tribe?" they offered him. The Levite agreed. When Micah confronted them, they coldly warned him not to interfere, lest some men become angry and you cannot prevent the harm. This act, apparently practical, was spiritually disastrous. The tribe of Dan was not only migrating geographically, they were also moving away from the heart of true worship. Upon arriving at Laish, the conquest was swift and merciless. They attacked a peaceful people without provocation or declaration. They attacked Laish, a peaceful and trusting people, put them to the sword, and burned the city. Judges 18 verse 27. Then they rebuilt the city and called it Dan in honor of their ancestor. There they established their new home and also a sanctuary led by the priest they had brought with them, Jonathan son of Gershom, grandson of Moses. The new city of Dan flourished. Its location at the extreme north of Israel transformed it into an important geopolitical point. It was the nation's boundary, and therefore, many passages of Scripture describe the country as from Dan to Beersheba. The tribe had secured a visible, influential place. But that material success concealed a deep spiritual disconnection. By establishing an independent center of worship, Dan fell into an institutionalized form of idolatry. They replaced the tabernacle with their own temple, God's presence with human idols, the ordained priesthood with a lineage acquired for convenience. The worship at Dan was a dangerous mixture of Israelite tradition and pagan practices. What began as an act of survival derived into a lasting deviation. Dan's migration to the north leaves us many lessons. It shows the danger of using cunning as a substitute for obedience. It teaches that external achievements can cover up internal decay. And it reminds us that moving away from the spiritual center, as practical as it may seem, brings long-term consequences. Dan had conquered a city, established a lineage, created a structure. But they had also usurped the sacred, adopted the false, and sown seeds of future destruction. God's silence in that story is deafening. There is no divine approval, no consecrated altar, no fire from heaven. Only a tribe acting on their own, convinced that the end justified the means. Mark, Epilogue: Reflections on Dan's legacy. The history of the tribe of Dan, with all its complexities, successes, and falls, is not simply the tale of a group forgotten in the pages of the Old Testament. It is, in essence, a mirror for every generation. It is the living narrative of what happens when potential meets temptation, when promise crosses paths with haste, and when identity blurs between comfort and commitment. From his birth in the arms of a servant woman, Dan carried a profound symbolism, justice, and judgment. His father Jacob described him as a serpent by the roadside, an image that, far from being just a metaphor, anticipated a dual destiny, to be an instrument of liberation or a seed of downfall. And both things came true. Dan was the origin of Samson, a judge with fearsome strength and a tragic story. But he was also the first tribe to establish an institutionalized idolatrous cult, marking the beginning of a national spiritual deviation. Dan never stopped moving. They migrated, relocated, conquered. But that movement, without roots in obedience, only took them further from the heart of God. They established structures, but without divine presence. They raised altars, but without holy fire. In their eagerness to survive, they lost the axis of their purpose. And when the tribes were mentioned in prophetic visions like that of Ezekiel or John's Revelation, Dan was conspicuous by its absence. The tribe had been erased from the spiritual map. Their history is a painful warning. It tells us that talent is not enough, that intelligence, without submission, can become arrogance, that success, if not backed by faithfulness, is a shadow that soon fades. Dan reminds us that true worship cannot be replaced, that the priesthood is not negotiable, and that God's presence does not dwell in temples manufactured according to our conveniences. But also, in the midst of judgment, there is a spark of hope, because although Dan fell, they also had moments of redemption. Oholiab, one of their sons, was chosen to design the tabernacle. Samson, despite his mistakes, died fulfilling his mission. And although in Revelation his name does not appear among the sealed tribes, God's heart does not close forever. God's judgment is firm, but his mercy always offers a path of return. Dan's legacy is, in essence, an open question. Are we using our gifts to glorify God or to build our own altars? Are we moving away from the spiritual center under the pretext of adaptability and strategy? Are we seeking the promised land without consulting the owner of the promise? May this story not be just a warning, but a guide. May it invite us to return to the center, to the true altar, to the God who calls, judges, forgives, and restores. May we, unlike Dan, not end up erased from the eternal narrative, but inscribed as faithful heirs of the kingdom.